Is it weird to say a game that was never released is somehow an integral part of my teen years? Because in some weird way, it absolutely was. Final Fantasy Versus 13 is a game that we will likely never know the full story behind, spending over 7 years in development before the announcement of its rebrand, and ultimately rewrite, as it would go on to become Final Fantasy 15, from Tetsuya Nomura's ambitious spin-off title to a full mainline game, but in the process would develop an entirely different identity than the one it previously had, and also losing a lot of iconic imagery and concepts that made fans so obsessed with it all these years later. And the assumption for years is that those concepts would never fully be known, never fully realized. That is, until the release of Kingdom Hearts 3. I've made videos in the past that well document all of the Final Fantasy Versus 13 references in everything we've seen thus far in Verum Rex. But the one thing that I had to think about the longest was from the Remind content. More specifically, the good and bad endings that accompany them. This is where, if you were in denial about the Versus 13 references, the game comes and whacks you across the head with them. I mean, there is literally a shot-for-shot remake of the 2011 Versus 13 trailer. This had me acting up when it first came out, but it's actually what happened before that I found more interesting and more difficult to explain until recently. The good and bad endings are rooted far more deeper in real life circumstances than I think most people realize at a glance. That is to say, I think this is a meta commentary, bear with me. Upon Yozura's defeat, you'll see him fading away, expressing that his power isn't yet needed, with him returning to his world, leaving Sora behind. However, if the player loses to Yozora, they'll receive the bad ending, and here's where things begin to get weird. The fact that there even is a bad ending. Square Enix's in-house CGI studio, Visualworks, is known for their impressive pre-rendered scenes, and they aren't cheap to make. So I couldn't help but ponder why one would spend the money and resources just to more or less render $1 million game over screen, unless it was to symbolize something greater than that, both for what it means in Kingdom Hearts and the symbolism and parallels it's supposed to represent to the player, a meta commentary. That is, just like everything to do with Verum Rex, the bad ending sees Yozora seemingly putting Sora into crystal stasis, a very specifically Final Fantasy trope most notably used in Fabula Nova Crystallis, the lore umbrella for Final Fantasy XIII, Type 0, and the belated Versus. You see, crystal stasis is what happens when a l'Cie completes their focus that either a fal'Cie or a Mother Crystal gave them. Look, if you haven't played Final Fantasy XIII or Type 0, I'll try to give you the too long didn't read, because if you have to Google this, I mean, look at this. Essentially, a demigod or crystal grants you a power to complete a very specific mission, or fulfill a purpose known as a focus. And when you complete that focus, you are given eternal life, in the literal worst way possible, by going into crystal stasis. In fact, if you compare Sarah Farron's crystal stasis to that of Sora's, their crystallization feels incredibly similar. Crystal stasis is never really used in Kingdom Hearts, especially not in this way. So why would Yozora be able to do this in the first place? You guessed it, Final Fantasy Versus 13. But all this amounts to more than just being a reference to Versus 13. I think what the good and bad endings actually symbolize are the situations surrounding the development of the games. The real life situations and consequences that I wholeheartedly believe director and visionary Tetsuya Nomura is attempting to communicate. And that is that Sora and Yozora actually represent Nomura's internal struggle between Kingdom Hearts 3 and Final Fantasy Versus 13, and what he went through developing them. The long stretch of time between Kingdom Hearts 2 and Kingdom Hearts 3, as much as it may seem, was not just to make room for dozens of not-so-spin-off titles, although it does feel like it at times. Rather, Nomura was too wrapped up in the development of Final Fantasy Versus 13, and at a later point in Versus' development, Final Fantasy VII Remake, to possibly work on Kingdom Hearts 3. All the way back in March 2010, before we had any confirmation of a third mainline Kingdom Hearts, Nomura was asked when KH3 was coming, and he said about the next title, Kingdom Hearts 3 depends on Final Fantasy Versus 13's development. Eventually, Nomura would have to leave Versus 13 turn 15 for Kingdom Hearts 3, and from what we can glean from interviews, not by his own choice, but by Square's. When Nomura talked about his removal from Final Fantasy XV in an issue of Famitsu Weekly, he simply responded, "It was the company's decision, I can't say more than that." It's clear that it was never his choice to step down from Final Fantasy XV, and this is why Kingdom Hearts 3 is the canvas for Verum Rex. I fully believe it's his way of expressing what fully happened in a way that he could never explicitly say. And all of this is to say that there couldn't be a Kingdom Hearts 3 without Versus 13 finishing. You could almost say that Kingdom Hearts 3 was in stasis. You see where I'm going with this? And that's the reality of what would happen if Versus 13, Yozora, won the fight. That Kingdom Hearts 3 might be stuck in limbo indefinitely. I even think Yozora saying, "I will save you, Sora," is really Nomura thinking how to save Kingdom Hearts at large, while being unable to work on a brand new number title, not before finishing the unending development nightmare that was Versus. This is the bad ending. Conversely, we have the good ending. If Sora, that is Kingdom Hearts, wins, Yozora, Versus 13, doesn't go into crystal stasis, but it literally fades away. And that's the price of Kingdom Hearts winning. Versus 13 doesn't get put on pause, it just literally fades away. It's gone. This context goes deeper when you realize where this is taking place. From Melody of Memory, we know this place is essentially the other side of reality, whatever the that means, where the world of Quadratum resides. The meaning of Quadratum? A square. Wait. Let's put this together. On the other side of reality at Square. Do you see how this is really not that subtle at all? On the other side of reality at Square, Versus 13 and Kingdom Hearts were in a battle for production for Nomura. And Versus winning meant Kingdom Hearts being in stasis, but Versus losing the Kingdom Hearts, as it eventually did, meant that Versus 13 would have to fade away. All of this ends with an oath to return. Now, does that mean an oath for Versus 13 to return? I'm sure that's what many of you would love to hear, that the elusive game of Eld is finally happening. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that it's an oath to take the concept of Versus 13 and evolve it into something of its own. It's an oath for those ideas to return in their own package, with Verum Rex using Versus as a motif. And this is what I think Nomura meant when he said, quote, "Only I know the full story behind Versus 13 and Verum Rex. However, the two are completely different, and I think an unexpected development is occurring. Indeed, I don't think that Versus 13 and Verum Rex are the same. In that sense, like he says, you'd need to know the full story of both to conclude that. And while I think aesthetically and inspirationally, Verum Rex is, for all intents and purposes, Versus 13, whatever it will end up being, it will end up being its own thing. But that's just my theory on what all this means. Subscribe, hit the bell icon, and let me know your thoughts on it in the comments below. And if you love videos like this, consider becoming a patron like Jonathan Wedge, who helps keep the channel going and growing. Link in the description below.